Ice had been forming on the roads outside Missoula since midnight, and by the time Cole Decker turned off Reserve Street toward the Pine Ridge Care Center at 7 in the morning, the parking lot had been sanded once and needed it again. He had his daughter in the back seat, 8 years old, named Rosie, who had fallen asleep against the window somewhere east of Lolo and was still asleep, which was a mercy, and in the passenger seat, a 4-year-old black and tan Belgian Malinois named Hatch, who had done one deployment with Cole and had been with him through every morning since, including the mornings that were hard to get through, including this one. Cole was not there for himself. He was there because his neighbor, a retired school teacher named Patricia Birch, had knocked on his door the previous evening and told him that the woman in room 14 at Pine Ridge, a woman she had visited every Tuesday for 2 years, a woman named Dorothy Spaulding, who was 86 and who had no documented family, had not been in her room on Tuesday, had not been in any common area, had not, according to a young aide Patricia had managed to corner for 60 seconds in a hallway, been seen by the regular staff in several days. The aide had not known why. The aide had said someone would look into it. What Cole, Decker, and Hatch found inside Pine Ridge Care Center that January morning, and what they uncovered in the days that followed about why Dorothy Spaulding had disappeared from view, would force into daylight a practice the facility had been running quietly for 14 months, and the name at the center of it would surprise every person in that building except the ones who had been watching carefully. If you're new to this channel, stay with me through this one and subscribe before you go. This is exactly the kind of story this channel tells, and there are more coming. Cole had enlisted at 21, a year later than most of his friends from Hamilton, Montana. The extra year had been spent in a way he did not describe in detail. A period of living in a way that did not reflect who he wanted to be, and a recognition of this, and the decision to stop. He was precise about the chronology, and vague about the specifics. He enlisted because he needed structure from the outside, until the structure from the inside was solid enough to hold. The military provided it without asking for his backstory, which was exactly the right amount of grace at exactly the right time. One deployment, Helmand Province, 2015. He had been a military dog handler, not the assignment he had requested, but the one he came to understand during the deployment was the one he had needed. Working alongside a trained dog in environments that required absolute present moment attention had been the right medicine at the right time. He came back from Helmand clear in a way he had not been since before the bad year, and he knew what had made the difference, and he had not been without a dog since. Rosie was his daughter from a relationship that had ended with more grace than many ended, with a shared commitment to the child that had been the best of what the relationship had produced. Rosie's mother lived 12 minutes away in Missoula, and they had managed the arrangement with the practical cooperation of two people who had accepted what had not worked and were focused on what did. Rosie spent Wednesday nights and alternate weekends with Cole. She spent Tuesday evenings volunteering alongside him at the food bank, which had been her idea at age 7 and which Cole had said yes to without reservation, because a child who wanted to do that at 7 was a child who should be allowed to, and because the food bank, like Patricia Birch's Tuesday visits to Pine Ridge, was the kind of commitment that required showing up regardless of the week, which was a thing Cole wanted Rosie to know about from the inside. Hatch was the animal Cole had been placed with after Helmand, through a handler-to-handler transfer arrangement, from a K-9 unit that was restructuring its patrol assignments. He was precise and economical in his movements. Not nervous, not excitable, but precise, the way a well-trained working dog is precise, like a tool that knows its own quality. He had one habit that was not part of his training and was entirely his own, which was that when Cole was sitting still, and the quality of the stillness shifted toward the difficult kind, Hatch would stand from wherever he had been lying, walk to Cole, and place his head in Cole's lap and wait. He did not solicit anything. He offered weight and warmth and proximity. And when the quality of the stillness shifted back, he would return to where he had been and lie down again, without ceremony, as though he had simply been consulting a piece of equipment that needed brief calibration. Patricia Birch was 67 and had been a 5th-grade teacher in the Missoula School District for 30 years and had the manner that 30 years of 5th grade produces in a person, a specific combination of patience and clarity, and a very accurate sense of when someone was not telling her the full truth. She had started visiting Pine Ridge Care Center after her own mother had spent 18 months there before her death, and she had seen, during those 18 months, how much the presence of a consistent visitor mattered to a person in a facility, and she had decided when her mother died that she would continue to provide it to someone else. She had been assigned Dorothy Spaulding by the volunteer coordinator 2 years ago. She had come every Tuesday since. Dorothy Spaulding was 86 years old and had been a bookkeeper for a family-owned hardware business in Missoula for 28 years. Meticulous work that suited her, the kind of order that functions as beauty for certain people and as rest. She had been married for 31 years to a man named Arthur who died of a heart attack at 62. She kept the house for 14 years before her hip made it impractical, and the move to Pine Ridge was arranged by a social worker who handled the paperwork with professional efficiency and noted in the intake file accurately that Dorothy had no living relatives and no documented next of kin. This last fact, no family, was true in the technical sense. It was not true in the sense that Patricia Birch understood it, which was the fuller sense. Dorothy had people. She had a former colleague from the hardware business named Raymond, who was 78 and drove a 20-year-old pickup and who had called the business's main line for 6 months after Dorothy moved to Pine Ridge before someone told him the business had closed, and he tracked down the right number and called Dorothy on her birthday and twice more since. She had a neighbor from her old street named Bev Costello, who had moved to a retirement community in Billings 2 years ago and who wrote letters, actual letters by hand, every 2 months and received them back in Dorothy's precise bookkeeper's script on the same schedule. She had Patricia Birch, who came every Tuesday. None of these people were family in the legal sense. None of them were on file at Pine Ridge as contacts. None of them had been consulted about the decision that had moved Dorothy from room 14 to something the facility called Enhanced Memory Support, which was on the second floor in the East Wing, which had a different access protocol, which Patricia had not been told about and had not consented to, and which, when Cole arrived at the front desk at 7 in the morning with a dog at his side and a sleeping 8-year-old in his truck, and a neighbor's specific concern written on a piece of paper in his pocket, the front desk receptionist was prepared to describe as a routine clinical determination. Cole had not slept well. He had the clarity of a man who has not slept well, but has spent enough years operating on insufficient sleep that he knows how to set what he is feeling aside and work with what is in front of him. He told the receptionist his name. He told her he was there about Dorothy Spaulding. He told her he was a neighbor of Patricia Birch, who was a documented volunteer visitor for Dorothy, and that Patricia had a concern about Dorothy's whereabouts and welfare that had not been addressed through the facility's general information line. The receptionist said Miss Spaulding had been moved to a different care level. She said it the way people say things that are technically true and selected for what they do not reveal. Cole said, "What level and when?" The receptionist said she would need to get a supervisor. Hatch was sitting at Cole's left foot, watching the receptionist with the precise attention he brought to situations that had not yet resolved into categories he recognized. He was not growling. He was watching. Cole said, "I'll wait." The supervisor who came out was a woman named Andrea Goss, who held the title of Resident Services Coordinator and who had the organized efficiency of a person who manages the interface between what a facility does and what the families of residents are told about what the facility does. She introduced herself pleasantly and said she understood there was a question about Miss Spaulding and she would be happy to help. Cole asked to see Dorothy. He asked where she had been moved and why, and who had authorized the move. Andrea said that clinical decisions about care levels were determined by the facility's medical director and care team, and that the process was compliant with all applicable regulations, and that as Miss Spaulding had no documented next of kin notification procedures had followed the appropriate protocol for residents in that category. Cole said, "Patricia Birch has been visiting Dorothy every Tuesday for 2 years. Is she in the contact file?" A pause. Volunteer visitors aren't typically. "Is she in the contact file?" Cole said. The pause this time was different. Andrea Goss looked at him. She looked at Hatch, who was still watching her with the steady attention of a dog but has made a preliminary assessment and is refining it. She looked back at Cole. "I'll need to check," she said. "I'll wait," he said. He waited. Hatch sat. Cole stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the facility's mission statement framed on the wall behind the reception desk. Caring for the whole person, honoring dignity and connection, and said nothing about it. which required a specific discipline he had developed over years of encountering the distance between what organizations said and what they did. Andrea came back. She said the volunteer file had Patricia Birch listed as a regular visitor. She said she was sorry the notification process hadn't captured that. She said she would arrange for Cole to see Dorothy. They walked into the East Wing. The access required a code, which Andrea entered. The hallway was quieter than the first floor, not peaceful quiet, the other kind. Hatch's pace had changed, barely perceptibly, the way his pace changed when the environment shifted register. Cole noticed it. He did not say anything. Dorothy Spaulding was in a room at the end of the hall. She was sitting in a chair by the window in a house dress and a cardigan, and she was looking out at the parking lot with the quality of attention that is not watching for anything in particular and is not watching. It was the attention of a person who has been placed in a room and has decided to be present in it as fully as she is able, which was not very fully on this particular morning. She was smaller than Patricia's descriptions and paler, and there was something about the room that Cole registered before he could name it, which was that it did not have her things in it. The room had a bed and a chair and a window, and the standard issue surfaces of an institution. It did not have the books Patricia had described. It did not have the photograph of Arthur that Patricia had said was always on the nightstand. It did not have the small wool rug and the pattern Dorothy had brought from her house, which Patricia had mentioned twice as something Dorothy had specifically requested be allowed to come with her. Hatch walked in ahead of Cole. He crossed the room without haste and sat in front of Dorothy's chair. He put his head on her knee. He stayed. Dorothy looked down at him. Her eyes came to focus in a way they had not been focused when Cole entered. She looked at the dog with the expression of a person receiving something they had not expected and did not have a protocol for and were receiving anyway. She said, "Hello." Hatch did not move. Dorothy's hand came to rest on his head. Cole crouched to her eye level. "Mrs. Spaulding," he said, "my name is Cole. I'm a friend of Patricia's." Something crossed her face. "Patricia comes on Tuesday," she said. "That's right," he said. "She's been worried about you. She asked me to come check." Dorothy looked at the window. "I've been in here," she said with the plainness of a woman stating a geography. "They said it was better for me in here." A pause. "I don't know why they'd say that." Cole looked at Andrea, who was standing in the doorway. He looked at the room without her things in it. He looked at Dorothy's hand on Hatch's head. "Where are your books?" he said. Dorothy looked at the empty surface where the books should have been. "I don't know," she said, it with a precision that carried weight, not confusion. Precision. She knew exactly what was missing. She did not know where it had gone. Cole stood. He turned to Andrea Goss. His voice was the same voice he had been using throughout, which was the voice that required nothing to be louder than it needed to be. "I'd like to understand the clinical basis for this room assignment," he said. "I'd like to understand who authorized the removal of her personal items. And I'd like Patricia Birch on the phone in the next 20 minutes. He paused. "If you're not the right person to give me those answers, I need the person who is. The medical director. The administrator. Whoever is responsible for this resident's care decisions." Andrea said she would make some calls. "Have you ever walked into a room and known, before anyone said a single word, that something was wrong that shouldn't be? That someone was somewhere they shouldn't be, treated in a way they shouldn't be, and that nobody had bothered to find out? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one." What Cole found in the following 3 days came through a combination of Patricia Birch's memory for detail, a staff member named Luz Alonso, who worked the East Wing Thursday mornings and who had a conscience and a specific anger that she had been carrying for 2 months, and a document request Cole filed with the facility administrator's office on behalf of Dorothy under Montana's resident rights statute, a provision he had looked up the previous night on his phone in the parking lot while Rosie slept in the back seat. The problem was the facility's administrator, a man named Glenn Hartwell, who had been in the role for 14 months. In those 14 months, he had implemented practices around what the facility called voluntary level transitions, with the following effect. Residents without documented family or active legal advocates were moved more readily into the Enhanced Memory Support Wing, which billed at a higher daily rate and offered significantly less in programming, outdoor access, and personal space. Glenn Hartwell administered the wing's separate supply budget. Dorothy Spaulding had been transitioned on the basis of a cognitive screening administered on a Thursday afternoon in November during a respiratory infection that had left her fatigued and disoriented. The screening had not been repeated once she recovered. Her personal items had been moved to a storage room when her old room was reassigned. Nobody had asked her where she wanted them. Luz Alonso had raised this with Sandra Okafor in November. Sandra had taken it to Glenn Hartwell, who had said the process was consistent with policy and that Luz should direct future concerns through appropriate channels. Luz had been documenting what she observed since that conversation. She had 2 months of notes in a spiral notebook she kept in her car. Glenn Hartwell arrived at Pine Ridge at 8:45 that Friday morning. He was 53 tall, with the controlled manner of a person accustomed to managing institutions by managing the information that flowed through them. He had been called by Andrea Goss, who had given him a brief account of the situation, and he had driven in from his home in the Rattlesnake neighborhood with the readiness of a man who has handled situations like this before and has a prepared account of defensible practice. He had not been told about Luz Alonso's notebook. He had not been told that Cole had already spoken with Patricia Birch, who had already called Raymond, Dorothy's former colleague, and that Raymond was already in his 20-year-old pickup driving from Kalispell, and that Bev Costello in Billings had already called the Montana Long-Term Care Ombudsman's office before 8 in the morning with the directness of a woman who has been writing letters by hand for 2 months, to someone who has been moved to a room with no rug and no photograph and nobody checking. He had not been told that Cole's daughter Rosie, who had woken up in the truck and been brought inside, had been sitting in the lobby for 40 minutes and had said to a staff aide, with the clarity of an 8-year-old who says what she means, "Something's wrong here, isn't it? My dad's been in there a long time." The aide had looked at her, then said, "Yes, sweetheart, there are some things that need fixing." Glenn Hartwell came through the front door at 8:45 and went to the reception desk and asked for Andrea Goss. He was pointed toward the east wing. He walked down the hallway, entered the code, and came through the access door into the east wing hallway. Cole was standing at the end of the hallway outside Dorothy's room. Hatch was beside him. The light in the east wing hallway was the institutional kind, the kind that does not change with the time of day. And in it, Glenn Hartwell looked at the dog first, and then at Cole, and then at the open door of room 14 East, where Dorothy Spaulding was visible in her chair by the window. Hatch did not bark. From the moment Glenn Hartwell had come through the access door, a sound had begun from somewhere low in his chest. Not rising, not warning, continuous, the frequency of a thing that has already made its assessment and is simply stating it. He positioned himself between Glenn Hartwell and the open door of Dorothy's room without being told. His eyes did not leave Glenn Hartwell. When Glenn took a step forward, Hatch's weight shifted forward first. Glenn stopped. Sandra Okafor was in the hallway. Patricia Birch was in the hallway, having arrived 20 minutes earlier and having gone immediately to Dorothy's room and having come out with the expression of a woman who had been visiting every Tuesday for 2 years and was now looking at what a missed Tuesday could look like when the accumulation caught up. The Ombudsman's office had sent a representative, a woman named Carol Park, who had driven from downtown Missoula and who had a clipboard in the specific bearing of someone who shows up to facilities like this with some frequency and has learned not to signal. Her conclusions before she has completed her review. Luz Alonso was in the hallway with her notebook. Glenn Hartwell looked at all of them. He looked at Cole. He looked at the dog. Cole said, "Dr. Marsh, Miss Okafor, and Ms. Park have questions about the level transition process for this resident. There's documentation they'd like to review, and there are some things that belong in this room that should be returned to it." He said it with the evenness of a man who has already decided exactly how much voice this moment requires, which is less than the moment deserves and exactly the right amount to use. Dorothy's personal items are in storage on the first floor. I'd like them back in her room before we do anything else. Glenn Hartwell said, "This is a clinical matter, and I'd prefer to handle it in..." Dorothy's voice came through the open door of room 14 East. She had not heard the conversation in the hallway. She had heard Hatch, the low continuous sound, and she had turned from the window, and she could see Hatch's back from where she sat. And she said, clearly and with the full precision of a woman who kept books for 28 years and knew exactly what was in front of her, "He doesn't like that man." The hallway went still. Glenn Hartwell did not look at Dorothy. He looked at his shoes. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Carol Park's clipboard. He looked at Luz Alonso's notebook. And something behind his controlled manner changed, the way the calculation changes, in a person who has just understood that the number of people holding information has exceeded the number he can manage. He said nothing. Carol Park said, "Mr. Hartwell, can we find a conference room? The Montana Long-Term Care Ombudsman's investigation took 11 weeks. The findings identified that 17 residents without documented family advocates had been transitioned to the Enhanced Memory Support Wing during Glenn Hartwell's 14 months, at a higher rate than comparable facilities statewide, with documentation gaps in the clinical justification for most of those transitions, and a billing rate differential that had generated approximately $340,000 in additional revenue. The findings were referred to the State Attorney General's office. Glenn Hartwell resigned before the referral was complete. The facility was placed under enhanced state monitoring. Dorothy Spaulding was moved back to her room on the main floor the afternoon of Cole's visit. The books came back. The photograph of Arthur came back. The wool rug and the pattern she had brought from her house came back and went on the floor where it had always been. Raymond drove 4 hours from Kalispell in his 20-year-old pickup and arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway of Dorothy's room with his hat in his hands and said, "Dot." She looked up and said, "Raymond." That was the whole of the reunion, because they had known each other for 31 years and did not need a production. Raymond sat in the chair by the window for 2 hours, and they talked about the hardware business and the people who had worked there, and Arthur and Clara, his wife, who had died 4 years ago, and things that had nothing to do with anything and everything to do with the kind of company Dorothy had not had enough of in a room with no rug and no photograph for 2 months. Hatch lay on the wool rug in the afternoon light and monitored the room with amber eyes and found nothing requiring his attention, which was the condition he preferred. There are moments that feel less like arrangement and more like the stubborn refusal of love to accept the limits that institutions set for it. Patricia Birch, coming every Tuesday for 2 years, Raymond in his pickup driving 4 hours to say a first name, Bev Costello writing letters by hand on a schedule that matched Dorothy's own. None of them were family in the file. All of them were family in the sense that counts. What Cole Decker did was show up at 7 in the morning because a neighbor knocked on his door and told him something was wrong. He brought a dog who had learned to sit with people without requiring anything from them. He asked the questions that needed asking, in the voice they needed to be asked in, until the answers were in the room where the consequences could reach them. He did not accept no documented family as the whole of the story. It was one sentence in a file. It was not the truth. This story is for every person in a room waiting for Tuesday. For every Raymond who lost the phone number and found it again. For every Patricia who has been showing up for 2 years and doesn't know yet that showing up is the most important work she will ever do. And for everyone who has a person in a facility somewhere and hasn't been by in a while. Go. Go before Tuesday. You don't need to be on the form. You just need to show up. Is there a Dorothy in your life, someone in a facility somewhere that the official paperwork says has no one? Tell me about them in the comments. Let's fill this section with the names that shouldn't be alone. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe and be here for the next one. There are more worth telling. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.